afternoon, everybody, and good morning or good evening from wherever you're joining across the world. Welcome to the first Heritage session on peatlands at the Peatland Pavilion. Welcome. Thank you ever so much. My name is Dr. Rosie Everett, and today I will be presenting with my colleague from Historic Environment Scotland, Dr. Tom Gardner, and my colleague from University College Cork, Dr. Ben Gearey. This session is Peatlands, Climate Change and Cultural Heritage, Global Perspectives, Problems and Solutions, in which we have a fantastic range of speakers with us today. And that's it from me. I have no more to say. It's all over to our speakers. Fantastic. Tom, have you got any more before we start? No?
Yeah, Rosie, sorry. Can you just continue talking for a minute, because I've got a little kind of feedback loop. So if you could just crack on for a second, Rosie, I'll get...
No, so no worries at all. Our first speaker today is Clifton Vane from the IUCN. Clifton, you ready with your slides?
Hi, Rosie, yes.
Hi, fantastic.
So I'm here to give you an overview of the UK's peatland policies to look at how we've been taking forward some of the global commitments. The first thing to say is, there we go, that most of the policy work in the UK has, over the decades, to be fair, been framed within international obligations. So we've had the Convention on Biological Diversity, the various Sustainable Development Goals. More recently, we've had the United Nations resolution on peatlands, as well as a resolution on peatlands from the Ramsar Convention. The IUCN Congress 3 or 4 years ago had a resolution on peatlands, all of which identified key actions that nations should take for peatlands. Last week at COP26, we had a declaration on forests and land use, and it wasn't just about forests, it was about all ecosystems, and it highlighted the need for all countries to conserve and restore their ecosystems, as well as develop policies to protect them, and also to look at the funding around the protection of biodiversity. Those international principles have been brought into the UK Peatland Strategy, which we published a few years ago. It covers 6 key goals drawn from these international perspectives, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on those. But first, to let people know that the UK environmental and other policy areas are devolved into the 4 devolved countries, and each of those countries has responsibility for its own environmental policies and often funding, but there are also a number of overarching UK policies and funding mechanisms. The actions within our UK Peatland Strategy come into these 4 broad groups. There's the principle of understanding where our peatlands are and what state they're in. Then we have a range of policies, everything from policies to protect against built development, policies around agricultural development, and obviously in the past we had severe agricultural drainage resulting in about 80% of the UK's peatlands being damaged. We now have agriculture policy that no longer allows that damage. The same with built developments. There are policies to try and prevent that. We've also got policies around the restoration of peatlands, with each of the countries committing. Scotland is ahead in that it's put its targets for restoration into law within its Climate Change Act. We also have policies around funding, commitments to fund the restoration, and commitments to support land managers with funding so that they can restore and maintain peatlands. The UK just last year, for the first time, had all 4 countries with their own peatland plans nested within the UK's strategy. So that's a fantastic achievement to have peatlands covered so comprehensively across the UK. And as I said in the previous slide, most of these plans pick up on the range of actions from understanding the state of the peatlands, policies to protect and restore, funding mechanisms to help land managers, and also communication is a strong part of that, and I'll explain a wee bit later. And it's worth saying that within each of these 4 plans, this is where you see the historic environment coming up, both recognising the significance of the historic environment within peatlands, but also looking at ways to protect the historic environment when land management takes place on peatlands. Natural England and Historic Environment have announced within the England plan that they intend to produce guidance, to publish guidance on peatland restoration and the historic archive, recognising that when restoration projects take place, there is a risk to the historic archive, and best practice will allow proper assessment and methods to be put in place to avoid that. And a number of projects across the UK, we have several hundred peatland restoration projects now, and many of them have developed their own good practice. And I think what we're seeing now is a more joined up practice. And I'm just showing there on the slide the Forest Research good practice guidelines. We don't have that national UK set of guidelines for peatlands on how to restore them, how to look after not just historic archive, but biodiversity. And it's something that we really do hope can be built is a sort of overarching standard and recognised good practice principles for peatlands. The Peatland Code is part of the UK's mechanism to draw in private funding. So the government has many policies committing to fund peatland restoration and help landowners manage and maintain peatlands. The Peatland Code is a way of drawing in the private sector, businesses, particularly at the moment through carbon markets, but it can expand into other ecosystem markets. The important thing about the Peatland Code is it provides a standard so that buyers of the carbon are able to get something that is verifiable, is additional and transparent. But the code doesn't specify guidance on how to restore or how to protect the historic environment through restoration. The code expects there to be published somewhere else those good practice guidelines, and then the code requires that that best practice is adopted and the verifiers will check. So we do need this good practice guidance brought into play as soon as possible. Just turning the other direction, we've obviously had all these policies and funding to protect and restore peatlands and the historic archive within them, but the historic archive itself can inform policy. And we've got wonderful examples of some of the peat cores and analysis of past vegetation. Here's the example from Talamoss by Chambers and Barber et al., looking at how the surrounding woodland changed over the last 5,000–6,000 years. And that is informing the recovery and restoration of neighbouring native woodlands in that area. So the peat bog is showing what types of woodland, what species could be brought back after they were removed by human pressure over the centuries. Similarly, we use the peat archive to help us understand the impact of burning, and burning is a major land use activity in the uplands of the UK, primarily for grouse, but also for sheep farming. And by understanding how fire and burning has occurred throughout the past and what vegetational changes have occurred on the peatland, it helps us to inform policy around burning and the management of peatlands. It also helps us understand about climate change impacts in the past. If we see what vegetational shifts there have been on the peatland as it responds to past climates, then it'll give us an indication of how peatlands will respond to the future climate as well. Another area that's important, so when I mentioned the strategies are looking at the state of peatlands, we've developed an initiative called Eyes on the Bog, which is a way of monitoring for the long term how a peatland responds and changes either to restoration or as it deteriorates without restoration. And this initiative is also looking backwards, so the data that's collected can include historic data, pictorial images in the recent past, as well as paleoecological information. So it's an opportunity to look back and forward and to store that data in a single place. And then finally, the communication aspect of these strategies. I think it's really important that the peat archive is both used as a way to engage the public and get them interested. There are some fantastic stories. These are hazelnuts that preserved from about 3,000–4,000 years ago at the bottom of a bog, and that's Scots pine trees that were exposed by a reservoir flooding, and these are 4,000-year-old tree stumps preserved in the peat. So there are stories, there are ways to engage the public and make them interested in peatlands, but there are also ways to help people understand the land uses around peatlands. And I think this communication is a vital part of the historic archive aspect. I'll leave it as there. Thank you.
Wonderful, Clifton. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. Sorry, I was having some slight technical difficulties earlier. I am actually presenting from the front seat of a van because we've had some technical difficulties in the Glasgow Cathedral where we're supposed to be presenting from. So apologies for that. And thank you to Clifton for kicking us off and for Rosie for the introduction. I will just quickly give my little spiel. My name's Tom Gardner, Dr. Tom Gardner. I'm an archaeologist for Historic Environment Scotland, but I've trained as a soil scientist, and that's kind of how I got into this work upon peatlands. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'll just give you my little kind of spiel from our perspective. We are so happy to be here in the Blue Zone with the IUCN and the Global Peatlands Initiative. It is a huge honour for us to be able to bring to you, as Rosie rightly said, the first real kind of glimpse of archaeology and cultural heritage in the Peatland Pavilion. It's a really important story and a thing that can add a huge amount of value to ongoing restoration projects. We'd like to thank the IUCN and the GPI for helping us kind of champion incredible global cultural heritage across the world within peatlands. Clifton has spoken a lot about the UK picture and that joined up approach, which we certainly need. But we need to be thinking about global peatland cultural heritage, which is going to represent itself in different ways, both tangible and intangible cultural heritage across peatland landscapes and indeed some wetland landscapes. We need to be thinking of that. We are so grateful that you've allowed us into this space to allow us to explore how we as archaeologists and heritage professionals might help you, principally as ecologists and restoration professionals, facilitate, enable and add value to your kind of global movement to restore peatlands. We need to be bringing local communities on board when we're restoring peatlands. We need to be recognizing that peatlands are cultural landscapes to a certain extent, and helping tell that story is a real way that we can add value to the process and help smooth the process of restoration to hit those ambitious global targets that we have. The last thing I'll say on that quickly, and Clifton has very nicely bumped into this, we can help tell stories around paleoecology. We can help bring together data to design more accurate and more resilient restoration programs by understanding paleoecology. And in the end, by having a positive engagement with cultural heritage, it may be that even when we move to the carbon market for peatland restoration, that we can add value to those carbon credits within areas where we have a good representation of peatland cultural heritage in a restoration program. So I will be quiet, and I will introduce our second speaker, which is the fantastic Dr. Kat Hopwood-Lewis, who is the Senior Environment Advisor, brackets Peatlands, for Natural England. Kat, if you would like to take it away, that'd be fantastic.
Have you spotlighted me, Tom? Okay, I'm going to assume that he has. Can you hear me? Brilliant. So first off, I'll just retract the doctor because I haven't got my PhD yet. I've been asked to talk today about putting peatland historic environment policy into practice. We've had a really good overview from Clifton about international legislation and about UK-wide legislation. So I'm going to drill down into one of those devolved nations, which is England, and talk a little bit about the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme. But before I do that, I'll just quickly touch on why Natural England is involved with the historic environment at all. We're an arm's length body of DEFRA, which is the Department for Environment, as opposed to DCMS, Department for Culture, Heritage, Media and Sport, which is where our colleagues in Historic England sit. And I know we're hearing from Hannah Fluck later. And the reason why we're involved with heritage, even though we're better known for our work with biodiversity, is due to being a statutory consultee for landscape. And so our remit is not limited to designated historic sites. It covers a historic environment as part of the landscape. And that also involves things such as paleoecology, which we've already mentioned today. So I'm going to just quickly share my screen, if I may. 1 second. One moment. When I try and do my screen share, it doesn't want to do it. There we go. So that probably should have been on while I was talking, really, shouldn't it? So just to quickly name check some of the policy drivers here. The DEFRA 25-year plan actually contains targets against enhanced beauty, heritage and engagement with the natural environment. And Natural England is one of the bodies tasked with delivering that plan. If you drill that below the UK Peatland Strategy into the England Peat Action Plan, which came out in 2021, you can see that it's name-checked. Peat is name-checked as a record of our past. It's really strongly in there. EPAP, as we call it, also says that implementation of peatland restoration must protect the historic environment and that cultural heritage is a public good. So backwards slightly into the past, peatland restoration pre-2010 in England was quite an adversarial situation. I know that Tom has mentioned in the past about barriers that Indigenous people find between balancing peatland restoration and changes in management necessary for climate change, alongside changes that are needed for cultural heritage protection and for climate change mitigation. We've had some of the same struggles in the UK, and historic environment's been seen as a bit of a barrier. This quote here is from Lee Bray at Exmoor National Park in his excellent book, The Peat in the Past. If we look across to the current situation, however, we've got a real rapprochement between heritage bodies and environment bodies, and this is an extract from our joint guidance with Historic England. In many cases, doing nothing is a direct threat to the preservation of historic environment features, and I think that it's the climate emergency and the rates of peat loss and the threat to historic environment that's brought us to that juncture. So if we go now to the Nature Climate Peatland Grant Scheme, we can see that the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment listed unintended consequences of climate mitigation schemes as one of the main threats to heritage in the UK. So when we were implementing a new major scheme, what we needed to do was to ensure that that was going to take historic environment into account in a way that our previous England Peat Capital Grant Scheme didn't. So here's a quick overview of our structure. The main Nature for Climate Fund is £640 million, and a further amount has just been announced under the Net Zero Agreement. Peatland actually only has 55 million of that at the moment, but we're hoping for a share coming forward. And the rest of that is on Trees for Climate scheme. And our Peatland grant scheme has got two strands. So it's the restoration grant, which is the doing work. That's where cultural heritage mitigation sits. In order to apply for a restoration grant, you must have done a historic environment assessment, which looks not only at known features, but also at archaeological potential. And I think that really recognises for the first time the fact that the heritage of peatlands is really very unknown. We have a second, slightly smaller strand, which is the discovery grant, and that includes all the scoping works necessary. So we have some people who have been scoping under different schemes in the past. They've come straight into restoration grant, but our discovery grant people are kind of setting up partnerships from scratch. So one of the interesting things about this scheme, that as well as the carbon benefits that we score for, we're also looking at other public ecosystem services that can be delivered at the same time, as well as those usual ones that we hear about: water quality, biodiversity, flood management. We are scoring for societal benefits, and cultural heritage and landscape is one of those things. I have spent most of this summer scoring grant schemes. So Clifton mentions the necessity to integrate guidance. We've been really lucky working with Historic England. Colleagues such as Zoe Hazel and Louise Brown from Natural England have worked hard on this. The new Historic England publication, which focuses on the heritage of peatland itself. There is a joint outcomes-focused publication which forms an annex to this grant scheme. It is Annex 5 of the Restoration Grant, called Standards for Delivering Environmentally Sustainable Peatland Restoration Projects. To my knowledge, that's the first time in the UK that we've had that kind of joint guidance. And finally, really drilling down to the nitty-gritty, we've got, for the Discovery Grant staff, supplementary guidance for historic environment assessments for peatland restoration. It's not the catchiest title in the world, but this is a really interesting suite of documents. One which tells you what you're doing and why, one which talks about what good looks like, which is the joint publication, and then the Natural England publication gives one method of how to get there. And I know that Historic England are looking at putting together further guidance in the future. So what else do we have in the climate grant scheme? We have embedded staff member. I'm in there permanently for the next 5 years, to my knowledge. I give bespoke pre-application advice to people bidding for our grants, input into the scoring, as I've mentioned, support on any complex casework, although we will be expecting partnerships to have their own archaeologists and consultants on board. I undertake quality control before we hand out grant aid, and I'll be monitoring the results of this scheme, the impact on the historic environment, and what potential benefits we deliver. So when we think about benefits for the historic environment, we're talking about things like stabilising eroding peat, which overlies, underpins or contains peatland archaeology, re-wetting, which benefits paleoecology by excluding oxygen and restoring stable anoxic acidic environment. Moving away from wet heath and dry heath towards more beneficial blanket bog vegetation, which is actually less deep-rooted, less likely to harbour burrowing animals, and less likely to create bioturbation. And we can also include elements of public engagement within this scheme. I think Clifton's really name-checked how important it is to tell stories about the past in order to encourage people to embrace change. So traditional practices like moorland burning, which have been going on for hundreds of years in the UK, we are asking people to move away from that and embrace a wetter landscape again. And if we can use heritage to engage with them, that's a really valuable thing to do. So, we're up to so far. This is our first delivery. We've got 5 successful restoration grant partnerships with multiple sites on each, and these have all had historic environment assessments for all of the year 1 work submitted to me, and I've read the lot. Our work at the moment is clustered in the usual suspects, so that's the uplands of England in the north and in the southwest, but our discovery grant applications, the results of which will be announced shortly, I think on the week beginning the 15th, are much more spread across England and cover quite a lot of lowland peat as well. And it's really interesting to see on those restoration grants what type of archaeology we've experienced. We've got military, we've got a World Heritage Site buffer zone up near Hadrian's Wall. We've got Mesolithic flint scatters in the Pennines, and we've got a lot of tin mining and peat cutting archaeology down in the southwest. We're currently on track to deliver our restoration targets, which are both in terms of an area. I think it's 350,000 hectares that we want to tackle in the 5-year scheme, and the carbon benefits, which will follow on and be measured up until 2050. So in terms of best practice, I think this is really a great exemplar of how historic environment can be integrated into a peatland restoration grant scheme. It's got expert advice up front. Peatland contractors know what to expect, have planned. They're using a mitigation hierarchy to avoid damage, minimise where that's not possible, and mitigate only in extreme circumstances. So we're really looking at preserving in situ where we can. And going forward, we hope to really spread this good practice, both feeding into the new Historic England guidance, possibly setting up Peatland Historic Environment Practitioner Network for England, but if there's interest, we'll go further out into the whole of the UK. And we're going to capture those lessons learned and hope to share them with our other nations. Into the further future, we haven't mentioned agri-environment as a funding scheme before, but that's actually where my background in peatland restoration comes from, almost 8 years of peatland restoration in the Pennines. We're hoping to improve the way in which Natural England funds peatland restoration through agri-environment as well, and to include land management options for farmers to maintain the re-wetted peat and its associated historic environment features going forward. So it's a quick gallop through from me, but hope you found that interesting. And if anyone's interested, the Historic England publication is available, but if you're interested in the other two, they are not widely available, and you would need to contact the Peatland grant team via this link, which I'll make available, I'm sure. If you want to get hold of those, I'm very happy to share.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kat. That was fantastic to hear. And it really does show the way in which a kind of joined up and pre-planned approach within the grant scheme that you're dealing with can help smooth the way for delivery. I mean, what we really are trying to avoid, certainly across the constituent nations of the United Kingdom, is the historic environment being seen solely as a constraint. Obviously, there will be cases where historic environment assets will require a planned project to change its nature, to avoid things or put buffers into things. But by having a granting scheme that's designed to scope for these at an early stage, it means that we avoid a situation where peatland restoration bumps up against heritage in an uncontrolled fashion, which is going to slow down delivery, it's going to cost more money, and it's going to potentially damage cultural heritage assets. So by having an early kind of planning system in place, we stop peatland heritage being seen solely as a constraint, and we can plan for it being an opportunity. We can plan for it being something that adds value to the process all the way through, as we've spoken about in terms of engagement. I think we should also say that certainly we at Historic Environment Scotland, and I hope that Kat would agree from Natural England, we see peatland restoration as generally very positive for historic environment assets. So when you have archaeological sites buried in deep peat, they are preserved, and that's fantastic. But when those peatlands are degrading, that puts the archaeology itself at risk. So in order for us to essentially add this level of value, we need to understand quite early on where our historic environment assets are and plan for them. And that allows us then to restore peatlands, taking into the account the fact that archaeology is at risk. So we add value to the process by preserving archaeology. Peatland restoration is good for archaeology, but archaeology is also quite good for peatland restoration in terms of this way you can add value. So thank you so much for that, Kat. That was fantastic. And please do contact Kat about those supplementary resources. They really, really are very high quality, and there's a lot for us all to learn, I think, from the work that Natural England and Historic England have done on this. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who I believe is beaming into us directly from the Blue Zone, Dr. Hannah Fluck, who's the head of environmental strategy at Historic England. Hannah, are you with us?
I am, Tom. I feel like I should get the live audience to cheer for you, just so you know that there's a lot of people here. Can you hear that?
Oh my goodness, that's so exciting. I'll leave it to you, Hannah. On you go.
Believe me, there's a good number here. So it's a real pleasure to talk about success. I think we all know that climate change is one of the biggest threats to our heritage, the biggest threat. And the best way to address that is to try and limit global warming by taking action. As we've just heard, the role of peatlands in that is enormous. In the UK, I think it's probably the single most important thing that we could do is look after our peatlands. As they degrade, they emit a huge amount. But they are also incredibly valuable culturally. So, is this working? Yes, excellent. I have a strange situation where I can't see the screen and my slides, but I can see the lovely audience. So we know they're important carbon stores. We know they're critically important for biodiversity and habitat, for water storage, for flood risk reduction, water quality. And we've heard a little bit about how important they are for cultural heritage. When we think about cultural heritage and peatlands, we are usually thinking about archaeology. This map here is from Natural England report showing distribution of peatlands. We know that they're important for archaeology, but it's surprisingly difficult to know just how important. So estimates procured by Historic England suggest that at least 2 archaeological sites for every square kilometre of peatland in our lowland peats, which is a huge number. And I think it's to be many, many more than that. But it's also not just about the archaeology, although as an archaeologist, it pains me to say that. As we've heard, archaeology is a very helpful way to tell stories, that human story about our places, about our relationship with our environment through time. And there could not be a more important moment for us to be telling those stories and for communicating that with people. But our peatland heritage is also important as a heritage landscape in its own right. For many communities, peat has been a source of fuel. It's clearly not something that we want to continue doing, burning our peatlands, but the cultural connections with that land is incredibly important to understand. The historic environment features associated with that and other activities in those landscapes, the archaeology, those paleo-environmental records, those records that show 10,000 years of what people were up to, how that affected the environment and what the sort of environment was that people were living in. And I often say, as archaeologists, we can travel to the past. We're good at time travel. So if we can take people back to look at those relationships through that past, we can certainly take them to the future, which is one of the things that we're struggling to imagine at the moment. And there are the cultural connections and the intangible heritage, the associations with place, the oral history, the mythology, the art, the poetry, all inspired by these places. And all of that is incredibly important for trying to get people to engage with and understand and value them. I was at the reception the other evening about peatlands mattering, encouraging people to think about it. And I heard several speakers talk about how hard it is. People understand about how they should value trees. Making the case for peatlands is a little bit more challenging. And I would say that we in the historic environment sector can absolutely help with that. Anyway, all this is great, but for once, we actually managed to do something with this. We've got the historic environment and cultural connections of peatlands written into the national approach to preserving peat, restoring peat in England. And as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that this has happened anywhere in the world. So I think it's worth recognizing that this has come about through decades of hard work from many colleagues within Historic England, Natural England and beyond. And what I wanted to reflect on was some of the lessons learned from that process. We've heard a little bit from Kat about some of the more details within this action plan. Part of this process has been involved developing new resources. So we have a publication on peatlands and the historic environment, introduction to their cultural and heritage value. And coming very soon, I was trying to push my colleague before I spoke to you today about exactly when, but let's just say early 2022. We have guidance for carrying out investigations and work, which will look at the very practical ways in which we can address this. And we also have the work that Kat was referring to that relates directly to the grant scheme and how we can bring the cultural heritage interest to bear upon that. Many of these resources are hosted on our webpage, which means that we can constantly update as new information comes to light. And I'd encourage you all to go and take a look at that. But now just quickly to the lessons learned. This is trying to contemplate how honest we are about some of this. I think it's fair to say when we're engaging with colleagues from another sector, so as someone who works in the historic environment, engaging with colleagues who work in natural environment can be challenging. There are assumptions, we've heard about that perception that heritage can be a barrier to some of these activities, or people not quite understanding that actually most of our natural environment is the result of human activity or very closely connected to it. So we have to be aware that we're trying to engage with people who have perspectives that are very different from ours, and understanding that and being sensitive to that, and also using language that resonates with others is incredibly important. The other thing is persistence. I said this is the result of decades of work, and I'm not exaggerating. Colleagues have been plugging away at this issue for a very long time. And I think that persistent pays off, provided you find the right people, working with others, that collaboration, and taking those opportunities and recognizing those, which you can only do if you're working in collaboration. Particularly that relationship that we have with our colleagues in Natural England as we worked with this. It also requires continued investment. You can't do one piece of work on a topic like this and then run away. You've got to see it through. And so one of the things that's most exciting about this is, as Kat was describing, a commitment to continually invest in raising awareness and engaging with people in how the cultural heritage of the peatland restoration schemes will work practically on the ground. It's also all very well to make this theoretical point, but if you're not making that connect to what people are actually doing, the decisions they're making, then you're not going to get very far with delivering this in reality. And I think also small resources can have quite a big impact. In the end, what got this over the line in Historic England was a fraction of additional time for a colleague to work on this. I think it worked out about, it was less than a day a week, but that made the difference between actually being able to deliver something that is going to affect and inform decisions for many years to come. So just to summarize, I think we need to explain why cultural heritage matters, and it has to be about more than it's old, it's special, we quite like that. I feel that way, but if you're talking to people who don't feel that way, then they're going to need some other reasons why. And I think that idea of connecting other people, the way in which we can tell those stories, the environmental records, that long view of our environmental change and our relationship is critically important there, as well as those physical remains. And we also have to bridge that gap between sectors, and that often involves explaining our relevance. I'm hearing an awful lot around the conference. I think most of my colleagues from our Climate Heritage Network probably feel similarly. There's a culture-shaped hole in the middle of a lot of these conversations, and people often don't even realize that what they're talking about is cultural heritage, that it'd be relevant. So making that really explicit, using the language that can support that transition. And finally, anthropogenic problems need human solutions. That's the catchphrase of the Climate Heritage Network, of which we're part. But when we're looking at things like peatlands, we can look at the impact of past human interactions, human solutions that have perhaps had unintended consequences, and we can start to assess the way in which we might want to approach those things in the future. So I think, oh yes, I need to just talk about Holme Fen Post as well in Cambridgeshire, the picture on that slide. So in the mid-19th century, they hit a post into the ground to show the level of the ground. Over subsequent years, the agricultural activity in that area resulted in the shrinking of that peat deposit. A metal post, I believe the rumours are it's from Crystal Palace, I don't know whether that's true, was put in its place. So the top of that post that you can see is where the level of the ground used to be 150 years ago. That's the extent to which our activities have been degrading our peatlands. So I think it's a beautiful example of how our cultural heritage, how human activity from the past can help illustrate the impacts that we're having now. I'm going to hand back to you, Tom. Thank you.
Wonderful, Hannah. Thank you so much. That was exceptionally thorough, but also concise, very impressive. And I think that there's a couple of very good sound bites from that that we really need to hold in mind, that culture-shaped hole in peatland restoration at the moment. I mean, that's a global culture-shaped hole, and that's one that we need to fill, not just from the perspective, I appreciate there's lots of people just from the northwest of Europe talking here, not just from a northwestern European perspective, but from a global perspective, and bringing across indigenous voices in terms of thinking about both the tangible cultural heritage of peatlands, these sites which are buried in peat from thousands and thousands of years ago, but also those intangible cultural associations that we have with peatlands, place names, folklore, you know, the practices that are ongoing of peat cutting. These are all important, and they need to be recognized. They need to be recognized in this just transition to this new form of land use, and cultural heritage can act as the vehicle for really helping that through. So we're going to move quickly to a short kind of digital poster session. We have 3 submissions that have been given to us. Rosie and I are going to talk through these very briefly, and I think I'm going to share a screen, so that should be up and now. So I'm just sharing these as PDFs, so they're not terribly high quality, I'm afraid, but these are available to download on the portal which you're watching this on. So if you want to scroll down on that portal, you can click on the 3 download links, and those are each for those posters. So I'll just quickly talk about this one first and foremost. This is a piece of research which has been submitted by a colleague of mine, Dr. Yasmine Sibenga, who currently works at Partners for Innovation in the Netherlands, but when she did this research was working in the University of the Highlands and Islands. And as Clifton mentioned in his initial speech, one of the ways in which an association with cultural heritage can add value to a project is through paleoecology, through understanding better the past ecology and hydrology of a peatland, and not just a peatland as in a small area, a peatland landscape or a region that is high in peat. Most of Yasmine's research has been in the flow country, and I'm sure you'll have been hearing a lot about Scotland's flow country over the last couple of days and the kind of tentative bid to make it a World Heritage Site. You know, this work understanding the palynology and the paleoecology of the flow country at large really helps design mitigation strategies and restoration strategies that are going to be resilient long term, and also pay a level of respect to the past ecological history, which is in part human, of those landscapes. So I'm not going to speak you through the whole poster, but please do give it a look. It's an absolutely stunning poster with some very, I'm sure you can see it hopefully on the screen there, some lovely images and pollen diagrams and all sorts of things for all the ecologists to get their hands dirty on. So please go and have a look at that. Rosie, would you like to speak about our next poster? Let me quickly see if I can get the next one up. I think it will be, oh no, not that. Oh no, it's all going on. Well, I'll stop sharing quickly until I get things worked out.
No worry, Tom. I'll give a quick overview of it, and then if anybody's interested, can go and have a look in the pavilion to have a look at the poster. So this is from Dr. Francis Rowney and Professor Ralph Fye from the University of Plymouth. And actually what they are challenging is the narrative of the human impact on peatlands. So we're going to flip that conversation on its head. And instead of talking about the preserved archives that we can look at for peatland paleoecology, we're going to talk about the impact that human activity has had on peatlands historically, and the role of disturbance and how that impacts on the peatland ecology, and how over time this impact can be preserved in a peatland. So actually understanding that anthropogenic impact is not something that we can just see in contemporary peatland ecologies, but also throughout history. And that level of research is what we should be engaging with for the restoration process, understanding what it is that human impact has on the status of peatlands, and how that restoration process can essentially reverse that. So yeah, please do take a look. The University of Plymouth is one of Britain's sort of hubs for peatland restoration research. So this is a fantastic bit of work. So thank you very much, Tom.
Brilliant. And the last one we're going to quickly look at, it's not really a poster, it doesn't have a huge amount of text, but it is essentially a submission from our colleagues at the University of Glasgow, who have been running an exceptional project looking at the intangible and tangible cultural heritage of peatlands called Bright Edge Deep. And some of you may recognize that as one of Seamus Heaney's, or an extract from one of Seamus Heaney's poems about cutting peat. Again, this is available to download, and then that will give you a link to take to the online exhibition for Bright Edge Deep, and I would really strongly recommend you go and have a look at that. It has film content, audio content, text content. It is really a stunning kind of tell-all of peatlands cultural and tangible and intangible cultural heritage. And again, you can see those QR codes and associated, but that's mostly come from doctors Gareth Beale, Dr. Clara Wilson, and Dr. Nikki Whitehouse at the University of Glasgow. So please do go and have a look at that. It's an exceptional online resource, and it should be live for quite some time after COP as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and introduce our next speaker, who I believe has joined us, Tobias Tobias, who has come from, who's the senior advisor for the Ramsar, the Secretariat for Ramsar. So Tobias, if you could please share your screen and then take it away. We're all very much looking forward to hearing what you're going to say.
Hello, I hope you hear me well. I'm sorry about the flare on my screens. I'm sitting not far from the Peatland Pavilion, trying to find a relatively calm spot here. So I assume you hear me well. I also assume that you see my first PowerPoint slide. Is that fine? Okay, then let's go. Thank you for having invited us. Obviously, global policies can only be as good as the national ones who build them up. And I briefly summarize you what the Convention on Wetlands has been focusing regarding on peatlands. We are taking an integrative approach to all aquatic environments, coastal and marine. More than half of them do have peat soils. We're also looking at peatlands in an integrated way. So they include mires, fens, and bogs, but in addition also, because there are also peat soils, all the tundra peatlands, high altitude and subpolar mires, paramos in the Andes or so. And the same applies to what is called blue carbon, because underneath tropical swamp or mangrove forests, under salt or tidal marshes, and under seagrass beds, guess what is building up? It's peat soils. So from the carbon storage components, it's obviously the same. So I think I don't have to tell you this here, the kind of that the peat soils are valuable archives, but this is maybe an aspect that is currently a little bit lost in the international debate. Therefore, it's very valid and valuable that in countries like the UK or Scotland, that aspect is really carried on by you. The Ramsar Convention has been following a little bit 20 years ago that Heritage Management of Wetlands in Europe project, which is run by Exeter University. We were speaking about the palynology, the pollen record. Diatoms tell us a little bit about hydrology over the millennia. Obviously, bigger remains of trees and animals tell us about earlier communities, and then the human artifacts and up to the bog bodies. So in earnest, the focus by the Ramsar Convention on peatlands is started about at the turn of the century, when in 1999 it was recognized that actually under the Ramsar site designations, those with peat soils have been underrepresented. There have been more designated since, and that has been taken into account. There were 3 main areas defined: peatlands for water regulation, for biodiversity, for the specific bog diversity, of course, also, and for carbon storage. 20 years ago, there has been a huge conceptual program adopted for the nations for global action for peatlands. You have a number of elements there that has not been very thoroughly or very clearly implemented, or if it has, like in your country, it was probably not referred to that global action program. But we're hoping that this will be progressing. Then it was getting a little bit more quiet until around 2015, the new integrative view on implications of peatlands, on the implications for the Ramsar Convention was taken up in a resolution which was called Peatlands, Climate Change and Wise Use. As you see, the climate change was really coming into the picture. It did give a number of tasks to the different countries, 172 parties who've signed the convention, to the Secretariat to help them doing this, and also to our scientific and technical review panel. These themes come up because they don't happen overnight, so it does take a little bit of time. So I'm taking you through this now. In 3 years later, we have our COP every 3 years only. So the latest one was in 2018 in Dubai. There were two priorities clearly defined. First of all was that there was adopted guidance to designate Ramsar sites with peatlands, peat box to make it for short, not only for their particular biodiversity, for the water management functions upstream and a catchment, but also for the carbon sequestration, also for the climate change regulation. We are speaking mainly about sequestration here. Of course, in coastal peatlands, the shoreline protection would also work on the adaptation side. And the second priority was on restoration. The restoration theme was coming up clearly 3 years ago, restoring degraded peatlands, not only for reducing emissions from degraded peatlands because the carbon is oxidizing, but also for biodiversity enhancement and for disaster risk reduction, flood or drought risk reduction. And in parallel, another resolution was adopted on agriculture and wetlands. And I mean, insisting a little bit on this because this is where the things will probably have to come together. 15% of the global peatlands have been drained. This may not seem to be too much because it means that 85% are still in more or less pristine mire conditions, still accumulating carbon. But those 15 who have been drained are emitting too much greenhouse gases and therefore re-wetting the land use there, which is either forestry or agriculture in most of the cases, can be the solution. So certainly not draining any further peatlands, keeping the carbon stored where it is safely stored, and then switch to more sustainable agricultural practices. Having multiple benefits in mind, I think it was mentioned before also, not forgetting the heritage value or the historical values, and also coming then to something which is subsumed under the term of paludiculture, wet use. So coming now to the challenges ahead of us right now, and this is taken from a policy brief which we have just launched 2 weeks ago, is, as I said, the drained peatlands are responsible of 4% of all human-made greenhouse gas emissions. That's too much, and that is obviously a low-hanging fruit to reduce them. So peatland conservation is critical to achieve a balance eventually between emissions and removals or to achieve net zero. A zero balance can only be reached in principle if all the remaining peatlands, those which are still mires, accumulating peat, remain intact, and that if we can at least 60%, but likely all of them, of the degraded peatlands can be re-wetted. The sooner this happens, the better. If you look at the graph here, if this left is obviously sooner than later, the time axis is horizontal. If we are doing this earlier, then we can keep the temperature at a lower level than if you're doing it later. And then comes the issue into the debate, and how about methane? Yes, wetlands do not only emit CO2, also methane and nitrous oxide. Methane is a strong climate gas, but it's a short-lived climate gas. And if you don't turn peatlands into a shallow lake, because that one would emit a lot of methane, but if you just re-wet it up to the surface, then the methane peak is relatively short-lived and will go away eventually again. So these are the issues which need really now to come into the policy debate and hopefully also in the plenary room here at COP26. So we have published 3 outputs regarding peatlands, plus the fourth one on blue carbon. One is a global handbook for peatland rewetting and restoration, rather large and with many details, and who gives all the reflection on how to plan this, how to monitor what you're doing, how to evaluate and to do it better in case there are still things not working completely well. A companion volume would be a briefing note for practical people, those who go with the Wellington boots into the peatlands, how to reduce water leakages by blocking drains, how to do correct vegetation management. Either you probably have to take trees away and shrubs, or in other cases you want to plant specific shrubs or trees for specific reasons. And also you may have to take nutrients away because there may be too many nutrients inflowing in the basin and turning your bog into a fen or something else. And also give some guidance where to find practical guidance for different regions in the world, although the basic things remain the same between the subpolar to the tropical areas, but obviously the specifics are different in different areas. And then we have a policy brief, which was also released, which clearly says that restoring drained peatlands is a key to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement to stay with below 2-degree increase of temperatures. So agriculture and forest shall not expand any further, no further ploughing. We want to reduce the greenhouse emissions from the drained peatlands, that they can become again carbon sinks by accumulating dead plant materials and therefore carbon. And this requires about 20,000 square kilometers rewetting per year to reach the 50 million hectares of degraded peatlands by the year 2050. 20,000 square kilometers per year. This is a hefty objective and target. So let's get our boots on and start working for it. I think the messages have to become rather clear at this COP. It's already 26 in a row, but this is what we are producing. Thank you.
Wonderful, Tobias. Thank you so much. I think that was it. Sorry, it's Tom Gardner here, Tom, for the screen. That was an exceptionally, again, comprehensive and wonderfully detailed speech. And I think that there's a couple of things that really stood out to me. I mean, you mentioned again that this, peatland restoration is the low-hanging fruit. We're seeing that term a lot. The low-hanging fruit of fighting against kind of carbon emissions. And I think that that's a really important thing to bear in mind, that we are doing a lot of peatland restoration because comparatively it is relatively cheap and it is relatively easy. And I think an engagement with cultural heritage around that can continually be, it can still keep the costs down in terms of peatland restoration. We're not trying to add costs to this. This technical level of detail that you're providing is exactly what we in the cultural heritage sector want to see, because we're trying to assess potential impacts. And again, the fact that we have this level of technical detail around different processes, how different bogs and fens are working, how they are not working, allows us to design specific restoration processes for an individual bog and then green light those processes which we think are going to have the least impact upon cultural heritage assets. When ditch blocking is probably not generally going to be a massively damaging procedure, so we can green light things like ditch blocking, whereas other techniques may be more intensive. And I think also, Tobias, you've done a fantastic job of highlighting the scale of what we are trying to do. 50 million hectares by 2050. That is a colossal area to try and restore. And for us to be able to restore that, we need to make sure that where we are applying cultural heritage protections, those are proportionate. Those are not standing unnecessarily in the way of what we're trying to do as this global move towards peatland restoration, but they need to also be tailored to their local environments and to those peatlands themselves. So thank you so much for that, Tobias. I would love to introduce our next speaker, Diana Kapansky, who I'm sure all of you in the Blue Zone know and love and have seen a lot of from the Global Peatlands Initiative. So Diana is the Global Peatlands Coordinator for the UN Environment Programme. And Diana, I will let you just crack on.
Thanks so much, Tom, and really great to see those really important assets coming out from Ramsar. Congratulations, Tobias and the team that have been really working hard on that. That's exactly why we're here at the Peatlands Pavilion. And it's really my honor on behalf of the United Nations Environment Programme to lead the Global Peatlands Initiative. Peatlands matter for the climate, for people around the world, and for our planet. Found on all 7 continents, we're only just starting to understand and appreciate the role that peatlands play in climate change and our efforts to curb it. Being champions of carbon storage and capture, peatlands remain vulnerable to disturbances. Peatlands connect the world. There are natural treasures that provide critical breeding grounds and are rest stops for migratory species. Peatlands matter for people. Thanks to the multiple benefits they offer, peatlands support livelihoods and enhance human health and well-being. And for so many people around the world, as we've heard during this Peatlands Pavilion exposure, they provide a deep sense of place. They provide inspiration, mystery, and history. And the Global Peatlands Initiative is really working hard to save peatlands as the world's largest terrestrial organic carbon stock. We're now 46 organizations strong, supporting all countries to look at ways to conserve, restore, and sustainably manage their peatlands. Through the Global Peatlands Initiative project, we also directly support 4 tropical peatland countries of Indonesia, the Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Peru, with support from the German Ministry of Environment International Climate Initiative. We work around the world and across stakeholders to connect practitioners, scientists, investors, and policymakers through facilitated South-South and triangular collaboration. We try to forge new peer-to-peer partnerships, dynamic and action-based, based on best practice with a sense of togetherness to create really the scale and the speed that we need to address the climate and nature emergencies. Our diversity is growing and it's an asset, both in our partnerships experience and also the expertise that they have for the regions that they cover and where they come from. So we're really working hard right now and really happy to be connected to this heritage discussion as we try to diversify the partnership, welcoming more and more representation from youth groups and countries and beyond. And over the past 5 years, we've made some progress, including supporting international policy setting. For example, during the 4th United Nations Environment Programme Assembly in 2019, all countries of the world adopted a resolution on the conservation and sustainable management of peatlands. This resolution nicely knits together, building upon previous resolutions from the IUCN, from Ramsar, snippets from CBD, and also taking inspiration from the UN FCCC discussions. And so this resolution is really a commitment by all member states in the world to give greater emphasis to the conservation, sustainable management, and restoration of peatlands. It recognizes as well the global importance and also this need for interdisciplinary research, but also intersectoral decision-making. In addition, the Global Peatlands Initiative has been working in collaboration and with support from Germany, from the Convention on Wetlands, from the Greifswald-Meyer Center, UNEP, and many more, to establish ways to increase synergistic programming for peatlands conservation, restoration, and sustainable management within the different conventions. This has included working in complement to harmonize and strengthen peatland-related guidance materials, restoration resources, resolution building, and to also help see peatlands as an opportunity and a place for on-the-ground action to implement all of these multilateral environmental agreements at once. Later this week, we'll share some results and hear some examples from countries who have started to do just that. And we'll also hear from multilateral environmental secretariats themselves on why they also believe a joint call to action for peatlands is so critical at this point in time. The United Nations Environment Assembly resolution also asks UNEP and the Secretariat of the Ramsar Convention to coordinate efforts and create a comprehensive and accurate inventory of global peatlands, which will be crucial as a basis for identifying the extent of global peatlands, determining appropriate interventions, understanding the value and potential of carbon sequestration, and also understanding planning and processes and engagement for sustainable peatlands management. The Global Peatlands Assessment will be a foundation to establishing this inventory, and the GPI is working currently with more than 30 leading peatland scientists from around the world to establish this state of the world's peatlands. The assessment process will be ongoing for the next 1.5 years, as it really aims to fill this knowledge and research gap on peatlands distribution, status, trends, and pressures. We really do need to know where peatlands are exactly, and to also understand how they're changing. We need to work on this together to take actions on the ground to protect, restore, and sustainably manage these vital ecosystems, and building on the knowledge and the approaches of cultural heritage teams and architects is somehow what we're moving towards. We see more and more research, for example, becoming more interdisciplinary, paleoecologists working together to forecast and truth models, connecting also up with ground scientists and field researchers. So it's really a dynamic and a really exciting and quick moving space. This week, the team also coordinating the Global Peatlands Assessment will be sharing more about it and introduce you to the baseline Global Peatlands Map 2.0 developed by the Greifswald-Meyer Center. For those of you that are have the pleasure to be in the Peatland Pavilion, it's on the wall behind you. Another global push for results and action is the momentum that we have been building for the protection and restoration of nature, including peatlands. And on World Environment Day this year, the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration was launched. It's a global movement to stop, prevent, and reverse the degradation of all ecosystems on every continent and in every ocean. The UN Decade focuses on 8 broad categories of ecosystems, which interact to ensure our planet and our people are healthy. And UNEP believes that the next 10 years will count most in the fight against this climate and nature and pollution emergency. The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is open for all actors at all levels in all places. So please do join us and put your peatlands restoration assets and guidance and experiences on the map. So far, peatlands are very underrepresented and underreported as ongoing restoration initiatives. It's really simple to register as a restoration implementer. All you need to go to is the site, and you can also tag your efforts to specific peatlands, geolocated, or share other ecosystem types that you've been working on. This is meant to inspire each other, to join in, connect up, and create the scale and speed we need for our future. It is about tackling human-induced problems with human-based solutions. Everyone has a role to play in ecosystem restoration, and each and every single one of us can make a difference. We are the generation that can leave this planet in a better shape for future generations than we have found it. As policymakers, practitioners, and concerned citizens, we have an opportunity to make choices to support that next generation. And we can help them secure green and meaningful jobs. Restoration and conservation are jobs that are key to our sustainable development and protection of our precious cultural landscapes. So please do join us. Be a part of the solution. Join Generation Restoration. We seriously need all hands on deck, everyone working in their own expertise, but joined up for Peatlands action, for the people, for the planet. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Amazing, Diana, absolutely inspirational. Thank you so much for that. I think Diana's hit the nail on the head that this will take all of us, regardless of our specialisms. This will take all of us, and that, you know, new global peatlands assessment is exactly the sort of level of information sharing and interdisciplinary working that cultural heritage agencies and practitioners and individuals across the world should be able to contribute to. You know, a nation's undertaking or scoping works on peatland restoration should have their cultural heritage agencies, you know, online with that and contributing in this kind of joined up fashion, and that will allow us to deliver, or that will help us facilitate this global movement towards ecosystem restoration. So thank you so much for that, Diana. That was fantastic. I'm afraid we come to our final speaker, who is Professor Andrew Miller, the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Environment and Rural Affairs of the Scottish Government. Andrew is going to talk to us about the Scottish picture, and how he's kind of helping balance policy with practice as we deliver our relatively ambitious restoration processes. So Andrew, please, after you, and enjoy it.
Thank you. So thank you to Tom and colleagues for inviting me to speak at this session led by Historic Environment Scotland. I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Environment, Natural Resources and Agriculture to Scottish Government. So this means that I coordinate the provision of scientific advice and champion the use of science in policy making. I'm speaking today about the legacy of peatland policy, which was the issue that HES were interested to hear about. So when we think about the legacy of policy, let's first start off by reminding ourselves that peat is itself a legacy. It's the legacy of thousands of years of nature's physics, its chemistry, and its biology. It's the accumulation of that leaf litter and plant remains and moss, lots and lots of moss. And it's that legacy that we see that is inspiring us to conserve, to restore, and to value it. In some cases, the legacy of those thousands of years is revealed a little bit more strikingly than normal. Now, anybody who's had their wellies on across the bog for a while will be familiar with coming across bits of bog wood. Here you can see a stream bed that's shifted, exposing in the side the roots of these ancient pine trees, 4,000 years old, probably. That timescale, that legacy, which is underneath the peat, for me, is brought together most clearly, most beautifully, in these bogwood sculptures from Ireland. Here you've got three different timescales represented together. The decades of growth of these yew trees. This is a yew root. There's the root plate with a trunk. Then the millennia in the bog, which has given the wood this dark, dark, rich color. Finally, the lifetimes of the sculptors, Michael Casey here and Kevin, his son, who look at the wood and try to see which shape is within it and then reveal it in sculpture. It's striking that this water feature here with the birds is outside the head office of Bord na Móna in Newbridge. So that legacy that we see in the sculptures reminds us that peatlands have changed over millennia. They're changing now, and they can change again. In some cases in Scotland, they indeed need to change, as about 80% of Scotland's peatland is in poor, degraded condition. And some of that degradation indeed comes from the application of past policies. So in the 60s to the 80s, across the UK, maybe 17% of the peatlands were afforested, as you can see here in the flow country, with non-native Sitka spruce. Since the 90s, however, those policies are being reversed. And so there's large-scale forest to bog conversion, including here in the flow country, which reverses the effects of these historic land practices. Here you can see photos from between the 40s to the 70s of ploughing drainage ditches across the peatlands in Scotland. We're pleased that those land practices are no longer used today, but of course they have an effect which we can see on the very largest scales on the pathway for greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 in Scotland, set at 100% in this graph, down to net zero by 2045. You can see here the little red triangle represents the 75% reduction target that Scottish Parliament set to reach by 2030. So Scotland has front-loaded its net zero pathway. You can see, however, that the blue of history and the green of the future don't meet. There's a gap right around here of about 10%, maybe a little more in the emissions. And that gap is peatland. That represents when the emissions of the degraded peat were included within the Scottish inventory. So the effect, the legacy of peatland management in Scotland is detectable on this national scale. And that's because, of course, Scotland's land area is very substantially covered in peat. We used to say at least 24% of land area was covered in peat. We don't have down here in yellow the shallower wasted peats of the fens, which emit so strongly. Nonetheless, it's still true to say in Scotland that we can't look at every hectare of peat and expect it to be the same. As other speakers have said, the critical thing is to understand the subtleties, the local context of restoration and the local opportunity. So if we look at the different land uses for peat here, or land covers, for Scotland, we find here the intensive grassland, intensively used grassland, is emitting 34% of the emissions estimated for 2017. And that's covering just 4% of Scotland's peatland area. So a really high emission impact from quite a small area. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge to policy. It's a challenge to science. How good really are those numbers? And of course, the effects of the degraded peat influence its behavior, its resilience to future change, its resilience to future climate. We can see that in some cases, maybe the intensity or frequency of events like the Murray wildfire in April 2019, which burned across a large area of peat in the northeast of Scotland. And those questions for science come back too. So I mentioned there's the issue of where peat is, and that's been also mentioned by other speakers. So we have emerging data from my colleagues in the James Hutton Institute, supported by Scottish Government research funding. Dr. Matt Aikenhead has used further computer modeling using remote sensing data to estimate that not just 24% of Scottish land area, but maybe up to 30% of Scottish land area is covered in peat if you take our definition, which is a 50 centimeter depth. If you use the definition used elsewhere, which is just a 30 centimeter depth of this really rich organic soil, then you'd say maybe over 40% of Scottish land area is covered in peat. Now, of course, the scientists would be the first to say that these new estimates would benefit from more validation. In other words, more boots on the ground. And I hope we can look forward to working as closely as possible with our colleagues in historic environment and elsewhere, so that the time spent by boots on the ground is used as well as possible, and we can contribute to each other's discovery on the peatland ecosystems. For example, in validating maps like these. In Scottish terms, though, we have this huge peatland extent, this very high rate of degradation, and therefore a massive challenge in restoration to address that more than 10% of the national emissions inventory. To do so, Scotland's building on the work of Nature Scott's Peatland Action programme. Peatland Action has restored so far more than 30,000 hectares of peat over the past 10 years. Our challenge in future is now being funded by Scottish Government money to the extent of £250 million over 10 years. And we'd be looking for that to be restoring maybe 25,000 hectares per year. So the challenge here is now to restore every year on average nearly as much as all restoration over the sum of the past 10 years. The ambition doesn't end there, because noticing this Scottish Government funded programme, the UK's Committee on Climate Change in its 6th carbon budget decided that an even better target, which would contribute even more to reducing UK greenhouse gas emissions, would be if Scotland could restore 60,000 hectares of peatland per year. That is 10 times the maximum observed rate of restoration to date. So as this slide from Drew McFarlane Slack shows, this takes a partnership of landowners, of policymakers, of scientists to tailor restoration and achieve effectively this very, very high level of ambition to make Scotland a peatland restoration nation. But we can't do that alone. And so we were delighted to work with the Global Peatlands Initiative already in COP25 in 2019 to set up a bilateral event with the Chilean Ministry for Environment. And so here you see Chile's high-level climate champion, Gonzalo Muñoz Abogabir, the climate change ambassador of Congo, Mechthild Kaspers, the peatland lead from Germany, and my colleagues Ross Johnson from Nature Scott then, and Rebecca Arts, now of Nature Scott and of the James Hutton Institute, discussing the commonalities of Chile's and Scotland's and other peatland restoration. That's been led forward this year in the first Peatland Pavilion at COP26. Our Cabinet Secretary, Michael Matheson, has just signed a memorandum of understanding a week ago exactly with Chile's Minister for the Environment, Carolina Schmidt. So Mr. Matheson and Ms. Schmidt committed us to work together in science, in practice, in engagement, and in financing to understand how to share the best practices to make this blue and green nature-based solution work as effectively as possible, both for Chile and for Scotland. And now I have to go back and check whether those texts included the cultural artifacts that, of course, we understand today could so usefully contribute to telling that story of peatland in both of our countries. I'd like to end by just noting that in Ms. Schmidt's presentation, she referred to peatlands and the other wetlands covered by the MOU as places of current cultural engagement where families go out into the wetlands to spend their days out and have picnics. And this is a way, I think, of taking our story of legacy in full circle. We started from the legacy of nature, and now this peatland policy development here at COP26 is building a legacy for those kids going to picnic out in the peat. And so I look forward to working with more people from this community in order to tell exactly that story. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Andrew. Thank you so much. That was, again, inspirational and really shows the level of ambition and the efficacy of use of our time, our boots on the ground, as you pointed out. I think it was really important to note that policy does matter, and policy decisions made in the past are partially what we're dealing with now. And in fact, land use decisions made as far back as the Mesolithic and the Neolithic in peatlands have constrained our options for this land use in the modern period. So we're still dealing with all of this. I am afraid we were supposed to have a Q&A, but we've been talking for such a long time and having so much fun that we've not kind of run out of time. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to try and draw things to a close. What I'll do is essentially go around and ask our speakers each very quickly if they could identify what their kind of key benefits that you believe an engagement with cultural heritage would bring to the peatland restoration process. And I'm just going to go in the order that we heard from them. So I'm going to start off with Clifton. Sorry to put you on the spot, Clifton.
I think I covered it in my talk, really. I think I have learned an awful lot in my policy work by looking at the paleoecological record and understanding human impacts in the past to help us inform land going forward. And I think probably for COP, the big one is how the peatlands have responded in the past to climate change to inform us going forward. That paleoecological record is crucial for those policy decisions.
Fantastic, Clifton. And Kat, same question to you. Where do you see the benefits?
I think it's about storytelling. I think when we can engage people with bogs, get them passionate about bogs, think of them as a place that has previously been used and enjoyed by people, that had economic significance, we can start to get them to value those bogs and to commit to looking after them in a different way in the future. Brilliant.
Hannah, what are your kind of closing views?
Hi, it's harder as it goes along, isn't it? I think so. I would have said storytelling, but I'm going to go with humility. I think something in how we can understand and see very visibly the impact that we have had, not just in the recent past, but as you said, for over long periods of time, and therefore why we are so important to that future. You can't absolve people of that responsibility. It's not just about nature. You need that culture going forward as well.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Tobias, same question again.
Maybe a similar answer again. I think I mentioned it, and it has been reinforced. In the global debate, we should not forget the historical archives and what the peatlands learn us about the past and about the culture, the human cultures and their interactions with them in the past.
Fantastic, fantastic stuff. Diana?
Now, adding on that, I suppose, looking at the past also gives us connection and a sense of meaning. And I really hope that, youth and those people that actually live and work in the rural communities can connect to peatlands. It's a real green, meaningful job for the future. Peatlands restoration, especially in your neighborhood and honestly around the world. I'm looking forward to it. So it's passion, it's persistence, but first and foremost, it's definitely collaboration.
Fantastic. And Andrew?
Well, I'm going to end stereotypically on science, because one of the things that peatlands preserve is not just all that carbon, they're also preserving that record of biology, the record of chemistry and physics. And, you can see it in so many of the archaeological remains are being explored through historic science, through archaeological science. You can think about many different objects where it's the conditions in the peat that give them this fantastic preservation. So that's what I would end on.
Fantastic.
It's just another story, I suppose.
And with 1 minute to go, I'm going to turn us back over to Dr. Rosie Everett, University of Warwick. Rosie, I've got a slightly different question for you. Where do we, as the cultural heritage sector, go from here? How do we gather together and kind of find out or get our aims fulfilled?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. I just wanted to say, first of all, a massive thank you from myself, half of Dr. Ben Gearey from the Wet Futures Group. This leads us with the question is, this was an ambition that we started a few years ago to get peatland archaeology to COP26. And we have done it, and it has not been without the collaboration between ourselves as archaeologists, you guys as policymakers, and the global forum that Diana Kapansky and the GPI has given us. And I think that ambition is the way forward. That ambition for a joint working group where we can unite together with all our different interests to produce supportive guidance and supportive help in the peatland restoration process that both takes on the science, as Andrew has mentioned, the community that Kat and Diana and Clifton have mentioned, and also the peatland restoration processes that Tobias and everybody else here has been involved with. So that is our global ambition. We want a joint working group where we can bring everyone together and take this forward in a unified method.
Amazing, amazing, perfectly said. So you've heard it here first, everyone. We will be trying to organise a joint working group on global peatland cultural heritage to support our friends in the ecological sector, to help them answer these questions, to add value, and to make sure that, as Andrew said, when there are boots on the ground, they are being targeted in the most effective and efficient manner to so we can meet those really ambitious global targets. We're now a minute over time. I'll close on behalf of Historic Environment Scotland and my fantastic co-organisers, Dr. Rosie Everett and Dr. Ben Gearey. And also, sorry, not to forget, Dr. Mary Davis, the climate change manager at Historic Environment Scotland, has put a huge amount of work into this. So well done to her. We'll close by saying, peatland restoration can be very positive for archaeology, for cultural heritage, for intangible cultural heritage. But also, as we've explored today, we believe that an engagement with cultural heritage can be exceptionally valuable for the process of peatland restoration globally. And we will be working in a coordinated fashion to help make that easier as we move forward. So thank you all so much. Thank you again to the IUCN and to all of our speakers. We really appreciate the opportunity. And we will hopefully speak to you all very, very soon. Thank you.